And we will go ahead and get started. So I just want to welcome everyone again for coming in and introduce myself. So my name is Jessica, and I lead the marketing efforts here at CRSLI. For those of you guys that don't know, CRSLI is where we take a research-driven approach to supporting school districts on their equity journeys through our culturally responsive school leadership framework. Before we dive in today, though, to today's amazing speaker and topic, we really like to get a feel for who it is that is attending our events so that we can always be making sure we're better serving you. So if you are here today and you have a role in education, as I assume you do, we would love to know what your role in education is. We really like getting a feel for the diverse group of educators and leaders that join us on these kinds of events. So feel free to utilize that chat feature to let us know what your role in education is. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to get started with introducing our guest for today, Dr. Kenyona Walker. She is an Assistant Chief Diversity Officer and a highly respected equity leader with experience in both a large land-grant university and a major urban school district. Her work has centered on historically marginalized populations, especially Black women and girls. She's published research on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and today she's going to be guiding us through a critical conversation about why institutions often lean out of equity efforts, the barriers they face, and the structures needed to sustain impactful equity initiatives. So as we get started today, I encourage you to stick around towards the end, as we will have not just a moderated Q&A session with me and Dr. Walker, but also open up the floor to all of you guys here to ask your own questions. So with that said, I will let Dr. Walker take things away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. If my computer starts going slow, will you let me know and then I'll jump back on my hotspot? Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Before I start showing my slides, one, thank you for the introduction. Having my bio read is always one of the worst experiences of my life. But I am grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation to have a discussion about this work. As you mentioned, my background is in equity. It is who I am. It's what I do. And it was based on multiple personal experiences that I got into this work. And so I bring a level of passion to this work that I think may sometimes get ahead of me. So if I get really passionate on this call, I'm really doing my thing here. So I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join me on this critical conversation. And I will get started. Let me share my screen. Great. So we're going to be talking about the benefits and barriers of leaning into and out of equity. I have some notes on the side, so if I kind of forget my place, you'll see me kind of staring at those. First, we're going to talk about the current state of equity
Dr.
work.
Walker, not to
Yes.
interrupt you, on our side, the full screen presentation isn't coming through. Maybe if you try presenter view
Let me
or
try.
even, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that does it.
Perfect. Got it?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the current state of educational equity work. Some of you look like you are actually in that particular field, deeply enmeshed in it. So I may get a lot of mm-hms and amens on that kind of particular.
I promise to hopefully interrupt you for the last time here, but I want people to see the lovely slides that you're putting up here. And there's an option to either hit X or enter full screen mode. If you want to select one of those, we see something that says audience window.
Okay. Let me stop sharing.
Okay.
Stop sharing. Let me try again.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to go full screen because I really do want to present in full screen. What are you seeing?
We're seeing the seconds that stall right before full screen happens.
Mm,
Yeah. So
okay.
maybe just, yeah. Another option could be to just zoom in on the
Mhm.
slides and go through them that way. Just let me know.
I have never had this issue. I'm going to try one more time. And then if that doesn't work,
This
I'm
is,
just going to be talking.
well, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen that you're now on the slide. So I love this. Uh,
This is funny. Okay.
Try clicking back out of present, and I wonder if just leaving the slide and kind of toggling through
Yeah,
without
we may have
making
that.
full presentation.
Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay. How's this? How's that?
Perfect.
Thank
Great.
you. I appreciate it. Okay. So again, we're going to talk about the state of equity. We're going to talk about the bears. We're going to talk about the benefit. That's what you came here for, right? But before I get started, I really want to situate this conversation around what a great educational equity scholar, many of you know her, Gloria Ladson Billings, talked about was this concept of educational debt. That is the accumulated impact of not having resources and harm being done to our Black and Brown students. And so this is why this conversation is very critical, because we still have a debt that we owe, and we have a debt that we have to pay. And I don't know that anyone on this call would say that we've actually repaired that yet. And so in that sense, I really want to situate this conversation on the fact that equity work is reparative. It's a remedy to an issue that a lot of our students have experienced, some inside of our educational system, some outside, some have experienced it outside, and it's been exacerbated in our classroom and our school buildings. So it's going to be very important that we situate kind of what we're talking about in that realm. So the first thing I really want to discuss is the fact that we have been in this exact place before. What am I talking about? Well, we all remember 2020, right? If you were living in the Midwest, I don't know about other places, but we had students writing dear whatever letters. These were dear school letters. Our students in Columbus, Ohio were writing letters to their school districts, kind of chronicling all of the issues that were going on in their schools. Many of them were Black and Brown students, but also some of them were allies that were writing and saying, listen, here's a list of issues that our Black and Brown students are experiencing in our classrooms. We want to change, right? Everybody had been watching the TV. It really helped have a further conversation around the idea of equity occurring in our school buildings, in our classroom, on our school property. The issue is that we've had these kind of come to religion moments in equity work. If many of you remember in the 60s, we had the civil rights, we have the Edmund Pettus Bridge situation that some call Bloody Tuesday. It was essentially where we had folks, Black folks, allies walking together to ensure voting rights. And what happened on that bridge was a catastrophe. It was assaults of people who were really marching just to have equal access and right to a thing that was said to be afforded to them. What made that event different? Because this was not the only physical violence that occurred during civil rights, right? It wasn't. What was different about that event was it was televised. We had Americans sitting in their homes, and this particular event was caught on television. It was broadcast in American homes, and no one could unsee what they saw. So after that, we saw a lot of things happening, right? We would say that people were probably providing those remedies to the inequities that had been occurring. We saw some of that even bleed into our education system. But something happened between the 1960s to 2024, 2020, 2021, and so on. That pendulum that swung forward in 2020 that made it right to have conversations around the realities that many of our students was experiencing in the classroom, in their neighborhoods, in their homes, in their community. That pendulum swung back and knocked many of us on this call out, right? Some of us weren't knocked out, but we definitely felt the swing. So we had well-meaning people, educators, individuals saying, we need to stand up for these rights. This is what's going on. We're going to fix this. We saw a drove of DEI, chief diversity officers, whatever title you want to give those of us on this call who do that work. We saw those roles created. We saw money going to them. We saw initiatives. We saw employee resource groups, professional development, you name it. We got all of that in 2020. And then the wind blew back in a different way. And so what we had was a regression of all of the momentum that many of us were probably really excited to see. I know that I probably look younger than I am. I wasn't here in 1965 for the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but I have an understanding of what happened at that time. And you could have never told me that we were going to have this window open in 2020 and 2021 where we could really address these things. And the reason why we had that, NPR has an article about this, is we had the exact same circumstances they had when the Edmund Pettus Bridge situation happened. We were at home, we were on lockdown, we were watching TV. Some of us younger were probably online watching it. Nevertheless, we could not unsee a lot of the things that we were unseeing. And it really gave us the momentum and education to start having these conversations, revisiting them again. Then our students rose up and they wanted to be a part of the conversation. So we saw a lot of resources. We saw a lot of opportunities related to really addressing some of the inequities that our students were experiencing as it relates to academic, social, emotional learning, all of that fun stuff. But that pendulum has swung back. The window has closed. I think it's probably almost closed because we're seeing DEI positions completely absolved in many organizations. Specifically, we're also seeing it in education, which is kind of scary. And so we really have to think about what do we do next, right? How do we really talk about the state of equity work right now and talk about maybe why it is we're finding ourselves in this position for those of us who do this work on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to talk about really this educational equity, kind of what it is, what it isn't. We've seen educational equity defunded. We've seen it de-emphasized. We've seen it deprioritized. We've seen it damaged. We've seen it distressed. We've seen it just go back into the background. Yet and still, we see research every day that demonstrates a need for us to lean into this. Yale released a research article a couple years ago. I don't know if many of you heard of it. It was called Big Black Boy. It was a compelling piece because what it talked about is research that they conducted with teachers. These were preschool teachers. Preschool teachers were given something to scan their eyes where they looked in the classroom. They were shown a classroom of preschool students, and these were teachers across different racial lines. And they just had to hit the plunger to say, hey, I just saw a student misbehave. And so they had this research. Teachers were hitting the plunger saying misbehavior, misbehavior, misbehavior. Would anybody be surprised to know that none of the students in that classroom misbehave? But I think what would be more surprising is teachers spent most of their time watching and anticipating misbehavior from big Black boys. This research found that big Black boys who are bigger, are disciplined at double the rate of their white peers. So we know we still have work to do. These are preschool teachers, by the way. There was no real issue going on, but these are the perceptions that some of our educators are bringing to this work. And it is alarming that the state of equity right now is that it's being defunded, it's being deprioritized, it's bleeding into the background, it's being washed out by other initiatives. We're calling it by a different name. And so this conversation is critical because we really have to get to why we need this work to go on, why an Office of Equity, a Department of Equity, an Office of Equity must exist, and why we have competent individuals leading this work, and not just leading this work, but leaning into this work in a way that is most effective, because I believe that some of what we are experiencing is the impact of the work not being done effectively. And I think that some of us may, in our next slide, see some similarities in some of the ways that this work has not been done effectively, which quite frankly has caused folks to kind of, excuse me, lean out of this work because for some folks, it has not really produced what it was they thought it would produce. So major barriers to effectiveness of equity work is first, it's not defined. That's one thing that I like about the CRSL, and I'm going to give y'all props a couple of times in this presentation because it is critically important for us to know what we're talking about. If my definition of equity is different than your definition of equity, and we're all working on the same thing, but we're all working on something different because we articulate it different, that is a barrier. We are all not on the same page, not all starting from the same line. It is very difficult to be effective in this work. What we find too is in 2020, some of you may know some folks, there were many people that were promoted to leading equity work in our schools simply because they were the best person to lead the work. They weren't necessarily an expert, but they were the best person at that time to lead the work. And what we have found is some of the barriers to the effectiveness of equity work is it's not led by individuals who really understand it. So not just that we've not operationalized it and fully defined it, what it looks like in our policy, in our data, in our day-to-day work, but also who is leading it and the skills they bring to this work is absolutely critical. Because when there's opposition, and there will be, because we know there has been, individuals who deeply understand this work and have a background in it are able to help withstand that. The other barrier to effectiveness is burnout. I have a couple equity leaders on this call. I'm assuming y'all are amen and clapping because this work is very, very difficult, but we know it's very impactful. But we have folks and under supported, folks who have been under-resourced in doing this work in our schools, and folks who have not been understood, and the personal toll that it takes on the folks who are doing this work in our educational institutions, our K-12 institutions, are tired. They're tired of fighting. They're tired of asking for help. They're tired of putting this initiative out and not having it go anywhere. They're tired of not being included in the things that are necessary to advance this work. They're tired of being called on for what I say is the fire alarm equity issues. Y'all know those issues. Somebody said some racist. Somebody did something stupid. We got to bring in equity, right? They're tired of doing the fire alarm, fire hose work. And so they get burnt out. So we're not defining it. We're not having the right people lead it. Folks are getting burned out. What I have found personally in my experience is there's very few plans on how to do this work. And when I say plans, I mean there is a lack of plans on how to do this work. How do we plot out the equity work for a district? How do we say, this is where we are in terms of equity, and this is where we need to go, and this is how we're going to get there, and this is how we're going to measure how we got there? There is no plan. And so when the board is looking for the equity report, when the superintendent is looking to validate the work of the office, paying for all these FTEs and all these benefits, when there is no plan, it is really, really hard to center people on the fact that this work is being done right and is being effective. The other thing is lack of leadership knowledge. We have a lot of individuals who are leading our educational institutions who have feel like they've been personally called to lead this work, the work of education. But we have equity leaders who also feel equally as called to lead this work. But when there is a knowledgeable equity leader and the leadership that sits above them that are not knowledgeable and not willing to learn, what we get is our fast food kind of equity. Hey, can you put this together really, really quick? We need to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's not deeply ingrained in the system. It's more of a box checking. But we also don't get the cover we need to actually do the work effectively. And so we have people in place sometimes. We have them with plans. They're girded up. They're not burned out. They know this work, and they don't have the leadership support or knowledge to be able to really advance this work. There was an article that was written about how we situate equity leaders in our school districts, and based on how we situate them, we can determine the impact that they will have. And so we situate them as ethics monitors. We can anticipate the impact they'll have. If we sit them in cabinet as a senior leader, we can anticipate the impact they'll have. If they report to the board or the superintendent, their oversight and authority and autonomy is different. That matters because when you have a leader that deeply understands the work or is willing to give you the authority and autonomy to do the work can be so much better. But if that circumstance does not exist, that is an extreme barrier to getting the work done because you can get the work but so far when you don't have board knowledge, board understanding, cabinet knowledge, cabinet understanding, and also just the senior leadership and the superintendents. And so I never really want to leave folks on super bad notes, but I want to stay here just a little bit longer because I want to really add a couple more pieces to this. Um, when our equity work is not systems based, is an extreme barrier. What am I saying? I'm saying professional development is great, right? We need to understand so we can get them to the place where they can actually enact the equity policy, the equity plan. But if we don't understand that there are elements in the systems that also must be addressed, this work is stymied at best if we have all this beautiful professional development and we have no way to advance it through the system. That is a barrier when we do not think about equity as a whole, which is why I also love CRSL. Yeah, because this organization sees it as a big picture, is not just professional development. It is moving from that knowledge base to action. Um, it is also a barrier when we just want to maintain status quo. Like folks are like, hey, can you just like do those equity events every year and just like go show up and do a couple presentations? Like, can we do that? Right? That is one of the greatest barriers to educational equity advancement. And that is one of the ways that we lean out really quick is people see equity as a dog and pony show. It's a box check. Can you come and do this, do this, do this? The last thing I'm going to add, and it's actually not on here and it's not on my notes, is, and this is in my personal experience, having led this work in several organizations in 2 educational institutions, is we have one brand of equity work where, we must confront these conversations, right? We have I say the 2020 brand of equity work where, we have to confront folks, right? About you're bringing this, you're bringing that. And I'm not going to say that that is a bad approach. What I am going to say is one of the greatest barriers to this work is we don't invite people into this conversation. We don't create an on-ramp for them to actually come in and say, hey, we need to address inequities in our system. I would love to invite you in to be a part of that. And then we have it defined. And then we have the right person leading it. Then we have the plan. We make sure the superintendent is on board. Everybody's sharing the load. We don't have burnout. One thing that I always say to folks, and if you want to quote me, please feel free to do so, is I don't own equity. It's not mine. The Office of Equity doesn't own equity. The Equity Department doesn't own equity. The Black folks don't own equity. Equity is everybody's right. Therefore, it's everybody's responsibility so that we can have a reality where our students are really experiencing equitable experiences. Now, we do need leaders to be able to build the pathway, the on-ramp, to be able to create a system and a structure that allows equitable practices to occur pedagogically, with discipline, with scheduling, with all types of things, with family engagement. And the last thing I will say on this topic, I attended a professional development during COVID, right after George Floyd, and a major racial equity, diversity, and inclusion scholar mentioned this term, and I always carried it with me. And she talked about this idea of weapons of mass distraction. And weapons of mass distraction is all the things that people bring to the table to distract us from the conversation about equity. That is one of the greatest barriers to this work is when we have people bring in, well, what about this group? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? That is a distraction. The thing that we're focused on is equity. Here is the plan. Here is how we're going to get everybody onboarded onto the plan. Here's how we're going to measure the work. And here's how we're going to understand the outcomes that we're trying to seek. And so I'm going to kind of parlay us now to, I think, some good news. And that is leaning in to equity, looking at the benefits of that. So my background, my PhD is actually in the experiences of Black women and girls in education, specifically related to the idea of sense of belonging. It is like the new hot topic in education. Everybody wants to kind of deal with it. Everybody wants to measure it. Everybody wants to be focused on it. Got all these wonderful programs around sense of belonging. And sense of belonging is simply this. It is that someone in this educational environment is concerned about me. They're looking for me. They have my best interests in mind. And they're rooting for me, right? That is sense of belonging. That is somewhat related to this idea of being culturally responsive, which is related to equity. When we know our students, when we know their backgrounds, we know their culture. We don't have to be experts on our students, but we do need to know about them such that we can create an environment where they feel like they belong in the place in which education occurs. When our students do not feel like they belong in the place in which education occurs, specifically our Black and Brown students, research tells us that they exit themselves from the learning environment. What is that? They stop going to school. Sometimes they start having behavior issues. So you may discipline them out first, and eventually they will remove themselves out of the learning environment. Why is that? Because they don't feel like they belong. That classroom environment was not designed for them. The school environment was not designed for them. The curriculum that we're using was not designed for them. Their point of reference is not anywhere in the learning environment. And so they exclude themselves. And sense of belonging is really designed for us to understand the students in which we serve, particularly our Black and Brown students. How do we connect with them in an authentic way? And how do we serve them in a way that is a remedy to the educational debt that Gloria Ladson-Billing spoke about? That is one of the benefits of leaning into equity work, is it increases sense of belonging. There's a lot of research that talks about when we deal with inequities in our system, our students feel like they belong there. I've worked in many places. I used to work at the YMCA. I did a little bit of coaching for folks and personal training. And I had Tony Colicchio was our director at our Y. And he set me down one day and he said, Kenyona, we want our Y to be the third place for people. And I said, well, Tony, well, what is that? So he started going through this idea of the first place, the second place, and the third place. The first place is generally your home, right? It's the place where you really want to be. Like for me, my home is where I want to be. When I get off of work, I want to drive up my driveway so quick so I can get my robe on and sit on my couch and enjoy my home. I love being in my home. It's just very comforting because it was made for me, right? I got a little divot in the couch because I sit right there and it's comfortable. And the people in there love me. And it was designed for me. So the home is the first place. The second place is generally going to be your place of worship. So we have, students or individuals who observe a religion, wherever that religion goes to worship, is your second place. Your third place, Tony wanted it to be the why. We want it to be school. We want it to be the buildings in which our students are learning about the world around them, which means we have to create an environment where our students want to be there. We have to address these inequities, because we should, bottom line. But two, one of the benefits of doing that is our students lean in with us, right? The second one is that we have an increased impact when we do equity work effectively. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, briefly, about how to do it effectively. Research suggests, specifically for Black and Brown students, when we address inequities in our systems, when we think about engagement from their perspective, when we create our school events, meetings, and different things where we're engaging our families, parental engagement increases, specifically for Black families. Why? Because someone made it their business to understand what it looks like to engage Black families. Our family engagement models, we have two major family engagement models in the US that most people follow. Those family engagement models were not created with Black families in mind. And so there is a third family engagement model that was created with Black families in mind. And that model talks about making sure that the school environment is crafting the experience in a way that's going to invite these families in. And also making sure that they're handling the events in a way that's going to be respectful to people's cultural beliefs and religious norms. The other benefit of really leaning into equity is our students don't censor themselves. One of the major findings in my dissertation, so my dissertation focused specifically on the K-12 experiences of students and how it impacted their academic success when they got to college. And I'm going to tell you right now, it has significant impact. But one thing that I found was when our students are censored in classrooms, specifically in a way that is inequitable, because we do know that teachers' perceptions of behavior and different things are different for our Black and Brown students than it is for other students. Our students begin to censor themselves. They mute themselves, right? They fly under the radar. Yeah, y'all know. Yeah, we do that. One of the benefits of us really leaning into equity and doing it effectively is our students don't self-censor, nor do their peers censor them. They are fully authentically themselves. They can fully engage with a curriculum. They can fully engage with the course content in the learning environment in a way that the rest of their peers do. And the other thing is effective equity work is tied to increased academic performance. Somebody said, how, Dr. Walker? Well, when we create equitable learning environments, I said sense of belonging increases, attendance also increases. And we know if our students are in a place where they want to learn, they enjoy like they're learning, it was created for them, they are present in our classrooms, that has an impact on academic performance. But let's think about this whole idea of being culturally responsive, right? We understand our students' perspectives, we're able to link our content to those experiences. What we know is that when educators share the culture of their students or they deeply understand it, the cultural capital that is extended is different than when they don't share the same culture or when they don't understand a culture. So you can go back and think about the students that are always on the list for gifted and talented referrals. Think about the students that are listed for this, that, and the other thing. When our educators are clear about the cultures that our students represent and they understand them in a way that honors them, our students' academic performance increases because they feel like they are in an environment, a learning environment that is sensitive to them and their needs. And so leaning into equity has major benefits, separate and apart from what I put here, but it has major benefits. I'm going to, talk a bit briefly about this idea of equity work really kind of addressing some of those big, what I call pillars in education, behavior, attendance, all those fun things. So the way that I approach equity work in educational institutions, as I said before, is to really invite folks into the conversation, but is also to say, okay, let us first figure out where are we at right now with this work, right? Most people want to start with equity work by just saying, let's do something. I think that's probably one of the worst strategies we can ever do. Why? Because we don't understand the state of equity where we are. So if I could make any recommendations to equity professionals about how to really lean into this work, it is to get a ground level view and understanding of the current state of equity in your district. How do you do that? You look at the data. You look at your data and you determine in all those categories, academics, attendance, behavior, office referrals, gifted and talented referrals, special education referrals, special education identifications. I can name about 10 buckets of data that you should be looking at to determine where are the inequities in our system. That's the first thing. Take a wide-eyed view of the data of the district that you are responsible for leading this work in. And then do what From Equity Talk to Equity Walk suggests, and that is sift that data down into those student groups who we know have been historically marginalized or closed out from certain opportunities. So that means disaggregating by race, disaggregating by gender, as many categories as you can sift that into, put that data into buckets. Then compare whatever that experience is of the average student to the rest of those. And what does that mean? So if I have a majority of my students that are doing well in English, ninth grade English, then I'm going to separate all the students who are in ninth grade English, and I'm going to see, okay, the average ninth grade English student has an 80% in English, or we have an 80% passage rate, let's say that. Then I'm going to separate all the students that are in ninth grade English, and I'm going to see who doesn't have that passage rate. Then I'm going to say, what characteristics do they share? Right? I'm going to first find out who is it that's not experiencing this success? Because that also will ultimately impact their outcomes academically. So if we can say, oh, we got an inequity in ninth grade English, y'all. Okay. We have an inequity in ninth grade English with, let's say, Black boys. Let's just say that. Then our next step is to figure out why. Why? And I use, in my previous place of employment, I use what we call the 5 Whys protocol. This is exactly how we taught our educators on how to look for inequities in the system, how to lean in the right way, so they don't lean out because they're getting burnt out. We said, why are your Black boys not advancing in ninth grade English? The first answer would be, they're bored. Okay. Why are your Black boys in ninth grade English bored? They want to be entertained. Okay. Why do your Black boys in ninth grade English want to be entertained? They don't have anything to do. Why do your Black boys in ninth grade English have nothing to do? They don't like the curriculum. Why do your Black boys in ninth grade English not like the curriculum? Because I've been taught as a white woman to only use white authors, white articles, white things. Okay. So we're taking an inequity that may at the surface level been perceived as a behavioral issue, as a lack of interest, all these things, to getting down to the root cause. And we may have data to confirm that, by the way, to get down to the root cause and to say, okay, this is an easy fix. We can then begin to work with our educator to understand how to, include a variety of authors, how to teach about certain cultures respectfully and responsibly. But we can get a really good bird's eye view of the current state of equity in all those different buckets by simply looking at the data. The next step is to build a team. You want to get your early adopters to this work and get them to assist you in developing the structure for how that work is going to occur. What data do you need to look at? Who do you need to have in those meetings? Who needs to be at the table so that when we do get to the point where we're ready to push something out, we don't have that lack of leadership knowledge? But then also try to align this work to board policy. I think after 2020, most districts, if they didn't have a board policy, and I hope they do, but if they didn't have a board policy, they had a commitment statement, they have a we believe statement, they have whatever statement they use to articulate that they believe wholly in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is who we are, the diversity is all those statements. Y'all know those statements. Y'all probably got them all saved somewhere. Make sure that work is deeply tied to those statements, because then we can start evaluating the extent to which this work is being moved. And the benefit to that is that we can watch the impact of the work as we start doing the work. Some of you may not, I just happen to have an evaluation background, so it was easier for me to be able to understand the inequities, to develop a strategic plan for it, look at the data, and then determine how we were going to measure our success. But many departments of education, I know in Ohio we have one, have kind of equity gaps analysis tools that can be used to look at data from a state perspective. The states generally, create those, so you can use those as well. What I'm saying is this: it is going to be very helpful for those of us who are in this work to continue thinking about how to do this work in the most strategic way possible, One, because we have to have an impact. We have to make sure that our students are having equitable experiences. We have to be able to have the data to support the need for this work, right? We don't ever want someone to question why we are paying FTEs to do work that should be a part of our day-to-day work in general. But we also don't want to over PD people to death without having a plan to have them take that new knowledge that they are learning and applying it now to looking at their data. And one thing I would suggest also is that when I've worked with educators, I've worked with them to develop kind of a rote memory. So we get a lot of data, right, as educators. I was a licensed school psychologist, so I had a lot of data I was going through all the time. But getting them to routinely review their data on a routine basis, doing exactly what I just described, sifting it out, they can find the inequities immediately. We don't have to wait for the annual data report. We don't have to wait for the annual report card. We don't have to wait for the quarter report. They have this data available to them where they can look at it and they can say inequity. The last piece I will say about this is where PD comes in. This is where it's important to have a person who understands equity work uniquely to lead this work, because we need people looking at our data in a way that's not pejorative. We need people looking at our data in a way that is not labeling our students. We need people looking at our data in a way that is asset-based and that is looking at it from a systemic perspective. What is going on in this space that these groups of students are having this experience, and how might we address it? If we don't do professional development, robust professional development that gets people to understand how inequities exist and how they persist, then we will never get people looking at our students and the data that represents their experiences in a way that's going to allow us to really unearth the inequities and to really address them. And so it's really important for us to think about how we do that. And so I'm going to wrap up here. We want to make sure we're aware of the fact that we've been here before, and we really want to try not to get here again. We want to make sure that we're aware of those barriers that often stymie the work, and for some of our colleagues, stop the work. And then we want to make sure that we're thinking about the benefits and how we can really optimize on using a systemic approach to really lean into equity in a way that's going to be effective and sustainable, which is going to be very key. So I'll stop talking.
So I think an rated feature that hasn't yet to come to Zoom, to my knowledge, is an actual audible clap that is able to be integrated. That was nothing short of amazing. Really, really appreciate you, Dr. Walker. I know that we have space and time for a Q&A to be live with the audience here. But before we hop into that and transition there, I have some key questions that I just want to ask to kind of maybe warm the audience up. Also, everyone feel free, if you don't want to come off mic or camera, to let us know any questions that you have for Dr. Walker in the chat. But I'll start off to piggyback on everything that you're saying in your recent experience. What would you recommend districts do now to ensure that educational equity actually occurs?
So I probably mentioned a couple of those answers before. The first is to understand the state of equity. If you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you're starting, right? You just need to, I say, have a real honest conversation with yourself with where the district is in terms of the state of equity, quantitative and qualitative. Because sometimes that quantitative is a mask, but that qualitative will really get to that. The second thing is to be bold in identifying the inequities and the gaps that exist in those experiences. That's really hard, but that is really the first step to really really addressing educational equity. The last piece is to develop a plan. So in my work, we had educators develop a Smarty plan when they figured out that there was an inequity. So we had a protocol. We call it AAA protocol. Acknowledge, analyze, and act. First, you got to acknowledge the fact an inequity exists. You got to validate it by analyzing data, and then you have to act. But act meant that you got to create an action plan. We cannot say, okay, yeah, we're going to work on ninth grade English scores. No, 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 no. What's the plan? Make it a SMART goal. And we push our educators to make it a SMART E goal, i.e., make sure that when you're trying to address an inequity, that is strategic, that is measurable, it's ambitious, it's realistic, it's time bound, but it's also inclusive and equitable. What you don't want to do is to create inequity while you're trying to address one. So we tell them, make your plan, swing back, do a program evaluation conversation and make sure your plan worked. And if it didn't, make tweaks. It's like equity work is like any other intervention. So if I could tell a district where to start, that would probably be where to start, those three places.
I think that that's really good advice. So the next question that I have here for you is, if an educational institution doesn't have the funds for a new position or initiative, what could it do to address equity?
And sadly, I think many places are in that position right now, particularly as it relates to the loss of the COVID funding that a lot of districts received. What I would have them do is to pull together a district leadership team. In Columbus, we call them DLTs, building leadership team or whatever, depending on what level it is at the district. And I would simply do a data review. And I would be looking at disaggregating that data. There are two resources. If you do not have any one of these books, I don't get any money from it. You should look at From Equity Talk to Equity Walk. That's more of a higher ed perspective, but it's the first couple chapters is really good in thinking about how to look at data to mask inequities. The other one is Street Data. Street Data is K-12 based, but it's a really, really good book that really helps people think about how to sit down with teams and find those inequities and think about building a plan. So if you don't have someone to lead the work, we love committees and work groups in K-12, right? Build a work group, figure out how to look at that data, meet regularly, and start thinking about how to address it by using those SMARTY goals.
Thank you so much for that. I believe that we have a podcast episode that kind of breaks down some of those concepts from
Yay.
from street data. So that's a great,
A
yeah.
great book.
So that's a
Mhm.
great recommendation. And then finally here, my last question for you before we open up the floor is, you've engaged hundreds of educators concerning educational equity. Of those, what had the greatest impact as it relates to the work that you've done for them?
Two things. And I'm actually glad we're discussing this. This gets to the point that I said earlier, I may have haphazardly stumbled on it. What I found is that for the most part, many of our educators wanted to have a conversation about inequities. They wanted to really have some conversations around student experiences. They didn't know how. And some of the previous work that had been done in terms of equity, also to the barriers, were the ways in which that conversation was approached really made them feel like they could not in the conversation because they were being judged. And so some of the greatest impacts that I was able to see was really understanding where educators' starting point was for understanding equity, culture, how to really understand their students. But the first thing was, we didn't do that first. The first thing was, let's understand what you bring to the educational environment. What lens are you bringing to your students' experience? Because we can look at their lens, but if you don't know that maybe you're bringing a very monolithic lens, or you're bringing a lens, maybe it's a rural lens or whatever, you are bringing the way that you were raised. And the way that you were raised tells you how to understand people, helps you make conclusions about people. And if we don't have anything to help us really confront that, it's really, really hard to have an impact. That was one of the most impactful things when we invited them into the conversation. Part B to this answer is, we invited them in by using the intercultural development inventory. I don't get any money from them either, but we call it the IDI for short. And the IDI really allowed us to tell educators, here's your current capacity to engage in culturally responsive practices such that you can enact equity on your day-to-day practice with your students. And when we would give them their results and they would be further to the left, the conversation was different. And so we would have educators that would say, this makes me think what messages I'm telling my own child about engaging with other cultures. Because if this is where I'm landing, I've got to be sharing this with my child. And I don't necessarily want my child to think that our culture is the best culture and that's the only thing that they need to be worried about in the world that they're going to join. And so we were talking about equity, but we were really talking about it from the educator's perspective, really inviting them in to explore some of the lenses that they were bringing to the work, which may have some blind spots.
Thank you so much for that. I know that we are nearing towards the end of our dedicated time here, so I do just want to kind of open things up for questions from our audience today. Again, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand or come off mic, whether it's to ask a question or um, discuss anything really that came up for you today from Dr. Walker's talk. So. Okay, we have a question here. How do you see the role of families and community members in partnering with leaders to do this work?
The roles of family and community members are very, very critical to doing this work. First, they're some of the biggest advocates for this work. Before 2020, families and communities were the ones that were saying there are issues, right? I think our families and communities are untapped resources in how we do this work many times. So I also have a family engagement background. Many times the solutions are with them. They know what they need, right? I don't know what they need. They know what they need. I know what my children need, but our families and our communities are the one who serves our students when they're not at school. They're in the community, they're with their families, and they know the type of experience that they need for it to be one that pulls them into the school and learning environment and that causes them to be very successful. So as it relates to equity work specifically, they are an untapped resource that many times are overlooked because y'all know we are the ones that say, we know what we're doing. We got it.
Thank you so much for that. That's wonderful. Um, Again, okay, more specifically, can you say more about what you mentioned earlier, how family engagement plans can sometimes be designed for white families versus families of color?
Yeah, so I've actually had the privilege of doing some research in family engagement. I have a couple articles related to it. One is specifically related to family engagement and special education, and there's a subsection around Black families. What we find is these family engagement models really value the Eurocentric form of school engagement, right? It's showing up to the meetings, it's coming to parent teacher conference during the workday, or it's coming to meetings during the workday. It's also at the school, is led by the school, those types of things. A lot of research suggests specifically for Black and Brown families, they want you to come to their space, to their places of worship, to the places in the community where they have trusted individuals who can really validate the fact that I need to do this, or I should be involved in this, or that this is okay to do. Because some research suggests that there's a low level of trust sometimes with our Black and Brown families in the ways in which they're being engaged in our educational environments. And so there is research to suggest that some of our methods need to be a bit more expanded. And I'll give you a brief example. Like I said before, I'm a licensed school psychologist. I've done my fair amount of assessments and evaluations for students to identify disabilities. I've also had a fair amount of conversations with families to deliver news that their child may have a disability that needs to be served through an IEP. And what I have found is many times I would sit with families. Sometimes they were Hispanic, other times they were Black, white, or whatever, they would say, well, you just tell me what you think, you're the expert. And I would say, oh, no, 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 no. This is your baby. You've been with them longer than I had them for like 2 days. I need to understand what you know about your child. I need to understand their assets so that when we do build this IEP, it's related to that. I need to understand all the things that you would value as it relates to making sure your child is served appropriately. That is a different conversation as opposed to the way that we would engage in our families with these other traditional family engagement models. A lot of the strategies just were not designed for non-white families. I think one of the first family engagement models was written, I can't remember when it was written, but it was written based on research that was only conducted with white families. And I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but I know that white families are not the only families we serve. And so we do have to have a more expansive way of understanding how we connect and welcome our families into our schools. And our students are an extension of those values and engagement strategies. So we have to use them with them as well.
That was incredible. This entire presentation has been absolutely incredible. Um, Dr. Walker, again, just from everyone at CRSLI, thank you so much for your time today. I'll give a final opportunity for maybe one final question, if anyone has one. If not, I do want to encourage you guys to just take a moment, if you have not already, if you are not already, to stay connected with us here at CRSLI. I just dropped the different ways that you can do so with us on social in the chat. Our handles are dropped there. We have really exciting upcoming events. We don't want you to miss the next EQUITYx, the next incredible speaker, like Dr. Walker here today. And also, if you were particularly tuned in about the portion about how to operate in equity, maybe without that budget, we're lightly teasing it right now, but we have an entire equity audit giveaway coming up on our socials. So make sure that you tap in with us over there. And yeah, if there's nothing else to add from anyone, or anyone wants to say anything else, I think that we could wrap here today.
They can also feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than willing to answer any questions or be a thought partner on this work.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys all so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. We will be in touch to discuss continuing to stay in this work together. So appreciate you very much.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye guys.